I want to talk about the states' rights doctrine from the early days of the founding and how they failed to properly apply the rest of the principles of our founding, and how, had it been done, had they done what they set out and started doing, continuing to do it at the micro level, um, a lot of things would have changed in the history of America, if you ask me. The Mormons getting chased out of the main part of America wouldn't have happened, I don't think. I think the slavery would not have continued as strong as it continued. Um, the Civil War wouldn't have happened because not near as many states would have seceded. The robber barons and the need for all this growth of government control over big business, I don't think it would have happened. Um, there's just a lot that would have changed. So recently we've been hearing from the general authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hey, we want you showing up to church not to be taught, but ready to contribute to a conversation. We want the teaching happening in the home. You guys need to be doing. They want us assuming responsibility for more. This is literally God's pattern. But I'm going to start off by reading from the Constitution of Heavenly Manner, the book version by Ezra Taft Benson. I highly recommend it if somebody wants to go deep into what the last prophet to speak authoritatively and extensively on the Constitution had to say about it. So the principle, so he, right here, I'm not going to read the whole book, I'm just going to read some excerpts of a section here. It says, some basic principles to understand the significance of the Constitution. We must first understand some basic eternal principles. So they're not just any old principles. These principles have their beginning in the premortal councils of heaven. So we're not talking about the President Oak's defending our divinely inspired Constitution principles, but the eternal principles that lead to those other principles, okay? Which then we will get into those here in a second too. The principle of agency. First is the principle of agency. We understand that the purpose of the Council of Heaven was to announce and present the plan of redemption for the salvation of all of God's children. The council was called that every man and woman could sustain the provisions of the Father's plan, which required that all obtain mortal bodies, be tried and proven in all things, and have an opportunity to choose of their own free will to obey the laws and ordinances essential to their exaltation. So, whereas President Oak says maximum freedom is one of the most important parts of, getting the government out of the way as much as possible where reasonable, will lead to some of the best testing circumstances in this earth life, so that we can continue to progress. We have to have the chance to make those decisions, not have the government make them for us. If the government makes them for us, the government is taking away the purpose of this life in the first place. Okay. So, in other words, there's no group salvation. It's individual, right? We believe that all men will be punished for their own transgressions, right? However it says in the Articles of Faith. Okay. Second basic principle, the proper rule of government. President Benson outlines, he uses scripture to describe what he calls the proper rule of government. One, that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and that he holds men accountable for their acts in relation to them. Two, that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. And then three, that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such governments. In other words, what are the three things here he just said specifically? Free exercise of conscience, right and control of property, and the protection of life. As soon as you start meddling with the exercise of conscience, the control of property, you're already whittling away at this list. Okay, it's a source of human rights. And the third important principle is the source of human rights. Rights are not gifts from one man to another, nor from one class of men to another. It is impossible to discover any origin of rights other than in the origin of man. It consequently follows that rights appertain to man in the right of his existence and must therefore be equal to every man. We're all equally human. Okay. People are superior to governments. We must understand that people are superior to the governments they form, since God created people with certain inalienable rights, and they in turn created government to help secure and safeguard those rights. It follows that the people are superior to the creature they created. We are superior to the government and should remain master over it, not the other way around. Government is nothing more nor less than a relatively small group of citizens who have been hired, in a sense, by the rest of us to perform certain functions and discharge certain responsibilities we have authorized. It stands to reason that the government itself has no innate power nor privilege to do anything. Its only source of authority and power is from the people who have created it. This is made clear in the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, which reads, "We the people do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America." And then, last principle, governments should have limited powers. Final principle is government can only have limited powers since, here, where does he say? Yeah, this sentence right here. This is going to be a really good one. So basically, the important thing to keep in mind is that people who have created their government can give to that government only such powers as they themselves have in the first place. Obviously, they cannot give that which they do not possess. So it boils down to, what powers do I justifiably in nature have over my neighbor, right? I have the power justifiably to protect my property, my life, and my family, my liberty, what have you. President Oakes would analyze, perhaps there's some limitations to how much self-harm I can inflict, and perhaps the eccentricities. So say, for example, I've made the analysis before of a really evil statue, or a really kind of degrading statue or something like that put up on the neighbor's property, right on the edge of their property, right next to the edge of my property, something like that, where it's visibly affecting me, and it is degrading the conscience or the morality of, I think there's a point where nature, the laws of nature would say, yeah, no, they can't do that, right? So again, I have a way of memorizing these. I haven't done it in a while, but it's agency, role, rights, people, and powers, I think is. So ARRPP is the way I've said it, I think, in the past. Principle of agency, proper role of government, which were those three things, right? And then the human rights, the source of human rights is God. People are superior to governments. God created people, people created governments, not the other way around. And then governments should have limited powers, because you cannot, they're all delegated powers. So President Benson's take right from the start is, any power that government has is a delegated power. So there's a case called Baker v. Carr, I want to say, and then another one called Sims v. Reynolds, and then one right prior to that, where basically people were complaining about the apportionment. You know how people are always like complaining about gerrymandering of the districts and stuff like that, and representation. Historically, a couple of states tried to imitate our style of constitution with the 2 senators per county, but then representation based on popular vote, etc. And after the 14th Amendment, these cases started coming up, about 50 years later or so, 60, 70 years later. People saying, hey, this isn't fair. They're not rearranging these districts to represent us here in the cities. There's way more of us in the cities, but because these rural counties have, this permanent kind of apportionment here, they're actually exercising way too much control over us. So 14th Amendment, equal protection of the law clause supposedly grants so much extended arbitrary power to the Supreme Court. It's insane. 14th Amendment needs to go away. It doesn't read like something that should have ever been an amendment in the first place. It should have been treated more as just a simple one-time declaration done. Okay, but that's besides the point. That's another conversation. I do agree with the 13th and 15th Amendments. Basically, the solution was the Supreme Court mandated that all the states stop doing any apportionment like that and start doing all apportionment based strictly on population, and the votes had to be strictly one person, one vote, no electoral college type of thing for anything like that, right? And I feel like they literally went the absolute wrong direction. Okay, Jefferson would have said so too. So Jefferson, he had lots of thoughts on the state of Virginia's government. he really highly advocated for the idea of breaking the state down into counties, leaving those counties permanently broken down, right? Which a county back then was just a horse travel distance, I guess. Basically, how far could you travel in a day? This direction, then that direction, you would call that a county, right? That the counties should have specific powers, or all the remaining powers to them, and that all the counties should come together and agree on a set of enumerated powers to the state government. And so basically create a constitution again. And then at the county level again, 2 senators per county or 1 senator per county, depending on whichever model people were advocating for, but then representation based on the population. Well, in the state of Arizona, historically, what we did just that, except for instead of actually taking a census to determine what the population was, we would just look at the count of the number of legitimate votes that came from this county, each county, and whichever county that then proportioned the number of representatives for the next election cycle based on the number of voters who participated in voting from that county. So, which is ingenious. It keeps it true to like where they actually live there, because that's where their vote was tabulated, right? And plus you see who's actually participating. It motivates people to participate. So anyhow, instead what they mandated is 1 person, 1 vote, and nothing. They basically mandated that states aren't allowed to do something similar to what the federal Constitution does. But you know what no single state has ever done that Jefferson advocated for is they never strictly delegated a limited number of powers to their state and then reserved the rest to the counties, which then Jefferson would have argued afterwards. Below the counties, you create wards within the counties, and then within the wards, you create, I think, families or something like that. But anyhow, you can imagine, you just continue to break it down. You enumerate to the federal government common defense, general welfare type things that have to do with, post roads, etc., etc. Then enumerate to the state government this, probably, control of water, some of the stuff that really matters. And a lot of the control of the water things too, if you think about it, depending, it might not make that much sense to put it at the state level. If you're talking about like running waterways, yeah, probably, right? But anyhow, I think the biggest mistake we made was we never broke down the power. We never told the counties that they were anything significant compared to the states. Had we had this type of model, secession probably wouldn't have happened near as much, because most of the counties in these southern states that seceded, they didn't want to secede. They wanted to stay, but they were the less populous counties. They were the rednecks. They were the hillbillies, like where I live right now. They were the ones who still wanted to stay in the Union. There just was way less of them than these rich plantation owners in what they called, I guess, the Black Belt, right, where the soil was really dark and really fertile, and those were the people that permanently wanted to have their slaves. And so most of the votes to secede from the Union were, one of my ancestors who was involved in the Civil War referred to it as an oligarchy, right? That the South would have been ruled by an oligarchy. I think the only thing that would have empowered that oligarchy that my ancestor pointed to is the fact that no one ever enumerated the powers. The assumption was the states had plenary authority. And so this assumption meaning that, in other words, whatever isn't prohibited to the states, they just have power over it, period. Right? If it's not already delegated to the federal government, and if they haven't already put it in a Bill of Rights of the states to, not do this to the people, not do that to the people, then it's just a power that belongs to the states, period. That's the states' rights doctrine. And it's a messed up one. It's a failure to continue as we started, because in truth, yes, the Articles of Confederation were created by the states themselves. However, the Constitution wasn't created that way. We bypassed the Articles of Confederation. Now, I do think the Articles of Confederation were inspired, because they did set that precedent for the government can only have the powers which are enumerated to it. There's no such thing as plenary authority over everything except for that which is prohibited to it, right? The Magna Carta, I don't think it's a solid analog for what our constitutional system is. Our constitutional system literally breaks down 6 levels of responsibility, or branches of responsibility, as I call them: legislative, executive, judicial, states, officers of government, and then the individual citizens. If you really follow the actual Constitution, it sets up the proper purposes of government, the positions of power, the manner in which the people's consent is given to those positions of power, the procedures for validating the exercise of the powers enumerated to those positions of powers, then the powers enumerated to them, the promises that they're supposed to guarantee, and then the powers prohibited, right? Just to be on the safe side, just in case you think this is a tangent to exercising this power over here, we want to make sure you understand, no way, dude, don't touch it, right? Which President Oaks called that his fourth inspired principle. Okay, all these comport, by the way, with President Oaks' principles, which his principles are: source of government power is the people. Then you have the breakdown of powers between the states and the federal government. Then the breakup of the legislative, executive, and judicial at the federal level. Then you have the the Bill of Rights. And then finally, you have the oath of office is to the Constitution itself, not to any person. And it's a written down Constitution. If it's not written down and presented for the ratification of the people or for the consent of the governed, then it didn't gain the consent of the governed. How can the governed consent to something you didn't write down and present to them, right? So don't tell me about, some imaginary backroom conversation. We all know they were talking about this. Are you seriously convinced that the entire population of the United States knew everything that was going on in that backroom conversation? I don't think so. So if it's not written down and presented for the consent of the governed, it didn't gain the consent of the governed. So government can only have powers delegated to it by us, right? In truth, there is no such thing as plenary government authority. Okay, coming back to these principles that President Benson just taught us about. And this is what was driving Joseph Smith so crazy. This is why the Saints got ran out of Missouri. It was centralized powers. Always. It's always come down to centralized powers. The robber barons, I guess they were given like straight up by the centralized state government power over eminent domain, stuff like that. Basically, nobody was stopping them because there was no sense of these other really powerful sovereign groups within the state that could come in and say, yeah, no. Right? So I agree with what John C. Calhoun did in the nullification crisis representing South Carolina. But where I disagree with his ultimate philosophy when responding to Joseph Smith is that afterwards, within the state itself, counties should have the power to do the same thing back to the state. The state should only have certain powers enumerated to it in the first place. They should analyze what those are, what's relevant, what's useful. If it's not relevant and useful, if it tends to lead towards tyranny, don't enumerate to them in the first place, and perhaps even clarify you only have the powers enumerated to you, 10th Amendment style, right? By the way, our 9th Amendment, you really need to ponder deeply our 9th Amendment. Our 9th Amendment says the enumeration, let me see here. I usually have my Constitution up somewhere. The United States Constitution. Always have, if you want to get good at the Constitution, you just need to always have it somewhere available to you consistently. I think about 6 years ago, I managed to print it onto 8 pages and frame it on my wall. And then I would sit there at my couch. It was like right at a point where I could grab down one frame or another and be like, what does this portion say again? So prior to that, I've been studying the Federalist Papers. If you're studying the Federalist Papers and you haven't studied the Constitution itself yet, I would say stop. Just study the Constitution. I had studied the Federalist Papers a whole lot, what have you, but you don't get it till you get the Constitution. Okay? All right, so let's look here. The enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, not the states. Barron v. Baltimore. John Marshall had already felt all this pressure from the bullying of Andrew Jackson and others, and the blowing off of the Supreme Court. So William Wirt, literally the most experienced Attorney General we had, who had recently stopped being the Attorney General, brings this case for John Barron against Baltimore, who they had done some damming and stuff like this or what have you that had caused his port for boats to become worthless. So he was deprived of property without the due process of law and was not justly compensated for it. So he sued him. He said it's a violation of the Fifth Amendment. And anyhow, then afterwards they bring the case Barron v. Baltimore with William Wirt, this highly experienced attorney. And as they're bringing this case, here, just a second. Sorry, my wife is just leaving. So anyhow, basically, Marshall looked at it and said, since it was the states who asked for a Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights only applies to the federal government and cannot be applied to the states. I think that's a bunch of baloney. I mean, first off, the whole Constitution itself was created by we the people, as President Benson just mentioned here. So, in other words, we bypassed the amendment process of the Articles of Confederation, which would have been a state level kind of process. And instead, we made it a people level process. That was inspired. I just think we failed to understand it, though. And so John Marshall himself, who was good at understanding the oath of office and how it needed to be applied, seemed to not understand that no, the Bill of Rights wasn't insisted upon by the states. It was insisted upon by the ratifying conventions, which the ratifying conventions were considered an act of the people. Let's read this right here. I guess you could see it both ways. Let's read it. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying the same. In other words, we're bypassing what the Articles of Confederation require. And if you get these conventions of people together, and the main population of these 9 separate states wants this, right? This Constitution goes into force. We do not have to follow what the Articles of Confederation say, right? Now, I think that was a little too vague. I think that was uninspired and that they didn't make it more positive. But I think the more uninspired thing is then just not continuing this pattern, not seeing that it was really always all about the people, not about the states in the first place. Okay, so what should have happened afterwards is then the states should have created similar constitutions with their proper purposes of government, their positions of power, the manner in which the people's consent is given to those positions of power, the procedures for making the exercise of the powers enumerated to them valid, and then the specific powers enumerated, the promises guaranteed, the powers prohibited, and then again a 10th Amendment style clarification that if we haven't given you these powers to the state level, they're reserved to the counties or all the lower levels, right? This is what should have happened. You would not have had, like I said, I don't see how the Civil War could have happened so easily out of that kind of structure, because most of the counties, you might say a majority of the population or whatever in these southern states that seceded wanted to, but it was a centralized population to a specific, I guess, black belt type region, right? Had the counties themselves, had the state not been seen as the sovereign, because it wasn't supposed to be seen as the sovereign. It says we the people, not we the states, right? There's a big difference between the way the Articles of Confederation was written. So anyhow, I've settled onto this. I think that the big failing of our founding is the failure of enumeration, first of all, at the state level. Number one, period. That's like a huge one. There's no such thing as plenary power in a state. It's just not there. Okay? The failure of enumeration. Then, instead of saying one person, one vote, do keep it like a little miniature compound republic within the state. Do keep it that way. And then even at the county level, enumerate again. Keep it relevant. Government should not just have authority. If it's something that's useful for a city to legislate over, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful for a state to legislate over it. And to impose that policy that's useful for this one city on all the cities of the entire state fails to acknowledge where the actual source of government power is. So government needs to exist. God is not a God of chaos, right? Again, let's come back and let's read this one more time here. I'm going to read it backwards, as a matter of fact. So first off, he says, I believe that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such government. We have to uphold them if they're actually protecting us in these inalienable rights and inherent rights. So what is it then? Let's see here. I'm going to go backwards here. I believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. And then let's go backwards again. I believe that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and he holds men accountable for their acts in relationship to them. Okay, so if you're, and let's look at the 6 levels of responsibility, but I'm going to say them backwards now, right? The people, the officers of government, the states, the judicial, the executive, and the legislative. Okay, we've turned to the judicial for way too much nowadays, and as though they're going to fix everything. We've made things worse because they're not even elected, right? They're supposed to be appointed only to deal with cases. They're constitutionally obligated to confine themselves to cases. And our current prophet, I guarantee you, if you had a conversation with him, he would agree. I've studied so many of his talks. They are not supposed to be constantly redefining the Constitution for us. They are not supposed to constantly be settling all of these fights between this government exercising too much power here, this government exercising too much power over there. We, the people, are supposed to be negotiating. The responsibility comes down to the local level again and again and again. The Utah Compromise, that's what made it so powerful of an example to other people, was it was people talking, not being forced. Not that the power option of force shouldn't exist. So the Constitution, I've already made the argument several times from the federal level. You have the take care clause. President shall take care the laws are faithfully executed. The supremacy clause tells us that the Constitution itself is considered the supreme law of the land. And so therefore it is a law. And so if the Constitution promises anything with or without legislation being enacted from the Article 1, Section 7 process, the president is obligated to. So Van Buren got it wrong. Van Buren got it majorly wrong. I think Jackson and Van Buren, I'm sorry, those guys right there screwed up American history big time. Okay? This case, Barron v. Baltimore, happened during the Jackson tenure. Mormons were ran out. Van Buren failed to recognize his take care obligations to Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1. Right? It's something the Constitution promises. Yes, he shall take care that it is faithfully executed. Article 4, Section 4, if you want to say the application clause right there, no, that's the backup plan. When it comes to common defense type stuff, you're going to find redundancies, not exclusivities, okay? Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 is a perfect example. If the states are being invaded and the federal government is incapable of doing anything about it or abdicates its duty, the states then at that point absolutely have the right, okay? This is the failure at the federal level too. The states should have been protected in their rights. The citizens should have been protected in their rights, even when the states were violating them. That's Barron v. Baltimore again. The states were violating the rights of John Barron, and the case was decided wrong. And so this assumption of plenary authority at the state level. No, the Constitution was not created by the states. It was created by the conventions in the states, the people within the states, okay? And anyhow, again, Jefferson was the one who recommended these kind of attitudes towards state governments. Nobody else really seemed to catch on. But consistently, I've pointed out, I think you're going to find Jefferson's most connected to the laws of nature and nature's God, or he's kind of that most important voice for us to understand what our attitudes towards government should be, even if he's off a little bit here or there. He's a human, he's a person. Even for those of us that believe in prophets, we believe the prophets are off from time to time. The only one we could believe was never off at all is Jesus. So I highly recommend studying Jefferson and Ezra Taft Benson, of course, Joseph Smith, and what he was dealing with. And yeah, again, I think Jackson and those two founders of the Democratic Party, not to blame the Democratic Party, this is not a partisan thing. They just happen to be they've got the weirdest stinking history when it comes to destroying the attitude of what the federal government should be able to do against the states and what the individual citizens should be able to do against the states and how you should be able to control that. Nobody seems to. And so I think my ancestor was right when he says, the secession happened because of an oligarchy, centralized black belt oligarchy, I think, and it wouldn't have happened had this kind of structure been in place, I don't think. I think we might have lost South Carolina and some other states, but it wouldn't have been enough to cause a civil war. And anyhow, I think that's what I got. I think 16th and 17th Amendment too, if you look at those, because we know the Reconstruction Amendments are because, of course, the Reconstruction of the Civil War. I don't think you'd have those. I don't think you would have where the states held to a more honest level of honesty. I think those two amendments would have gone away also. So, and I see that the 10th Amendment Center guy is getting ready to make a big video on making the 17th Amendment go away. I would agree with him. It needs to go away. But we also need to address the state level systems. If we don't address the state level systems, it won't make sense. Our state constitutions are too easy to amend, too easy for them to grab powers for themselves, too easy for all the power to be centralized in the cities, whereas they were concerned about it being centralized in the outskirts. Now it's too centralized in the cities. They meddle in things they shouldn't be meddling in. They want to have control over the ESA money. I don't think the ESA money should exist in the first place. I think lower the taxes. And there's I get out, and we have done this by Ezra Taft Benson, but he's got a fantastic chapter on education. And yeah, I'm in the right. I'm spot on in my analysis. I'm like, I had my ideas. I'm like, let me go see what Ezra Taft Benson used to say about this. Yep. ESA, a lot of people like it because they can homeschool. The truth is, homeschooling should have always been an option in the first place. The taxes for education should have always been less in the first place. Government education should have been confined to only the most relevant stuff. Discussion of whether or not the Ten Commandments is up in a school or not should have never, ever come to the courts. It should not be their business at all. And so we keep putting the wrong corrections on top of this opening error. The opening error was failure to make the states only have limited enumerated powers, have the breakdown of the counties, wards, and what have you. And instead we keep saying one person, one vote. Oh, the equal protection clause within the 14th Amendment. Oh, the Supreme Court's going to start forcing states to fix this, fix that. And so we've got what President Oaks described as the winner-take-all attitude, which he says is not good for the future of this country. Anyhow, this has been a long video, but I feel like I'm putting it off and I'm putting it off. And I finally just decided to ramble on about it. Please consider it, you guys. If you made it through to the end of this, you're amazing, but I doubt anybody. I doubt anybody will. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.